For coming out today. My name is Callie Klatt Golba, and I am the Curator of Turtle Conservation at the Peggy Notebaert Nature Museum of the Chicago Academy of Sciences. And I've been working in the area with turtles it's been 12 years now, and I'm really excited to share about what I've learned working with turtles, but also studying other species in the wetlands. Let's see if I can move. There we go. Okay. So, yeah, I will kind of start with my origin story because I think something I've been realizing is that conservation is not just a scientific endeavor. It also is really important that we engage the people that are doing the work and make sure that this is something that people are motivated to do in the future. So I grew up in the Midwest. I grew up in DuPage County, but was always exploring nature and catching fish, crayfish, frogs, toads, turtles, things like that, and was inspired to work to save these awesome ecosystems that made me really fall in love with the outdoors. And now I have two children, and seeing that passion and that excitement from seeing anything from a tiny little worm to a turtle is just something that keeps me going, keeps me motivated to do the work that I do. And I'm sure a lot of you also have stories like that because, being connected to nature is what starts people on this type of journey. So as I started my undergraduate and then graduate school, which I did at Northern Illinois University, I was learning more deeply about this global biodiversity loss and all of the unprecedented challenges that biodiversity was facing because of changes we've made to the landscape. And also through this whole training in my master's and PhD, I was learning that it's really important to stay objective and not kind of separate yourself from the work that we're doing. And for me, that was a little bit hard because the reason why I was doing this work is because of my passion and enthusiasm for the outdoors. So I was kind of not sure how to go forward and conserve these greater ecosystems that I loved, and also make sure that I'm maintaining that bias or not having that bias when working with these species. And I wanted to be able to save entire Midwest ecosystems, but unfortunately, conservation biology, we have limited time, limited resources, limited funding to do this type of work. So when I first met a Blandings turtle, that kind of started to help me answer that question. Were these Blandings turtles, they live in a lot of different habitats and they use wetlands and uplands, and they live for a very long time. So they could be used as an umbrella species for Midwest ecosystems. So when we conserve them, maybe we'll also be able to conserve all of the other awesome species in the area. And while I was doing this, I was still trying to make sure that I was remaining a stoic scientist that was doing the work and not getting emotionally involved with what was going on. But I still had this thought that it's important. The reason why I'm here today is because I fell in love with these animals. So I kind of was trying to answer the question for myself, how do I continue to do this work as a good, rigorous scientist, but also use my passion to share that with others and help others have that emotional connection? So a turtle that helped me answer this question was Viola. She's a Blandings turtle, and I've followed her over a decade as part of my Blandings turtle research, and she really changed how I thought about science and conservation. So today, while I'm telling the story of my research, I'm also going to be telling the story of Viola, this really interesting turtle, and how the work we've been doing with her wetlands. So today I'm going to start by giving a little bit of background information and then go into my scientific questions and the methods we use. And then we'll talk about some of the other species that we catch in these wetlands and what we've found, and then also talk a little bit more in depth about Blandings turtles and that research, and then sum it all up at the end. And I think throughout Maybe because it's virtually, it might be easier to save questions for the end, but if you want to drop them in the chat, I'm not sure I'll be able to see them, but at the very end, I can make sure to check those out. All right. And everyone's still with me?
Yep, you're good to
Okay.
go.
Okay, thank you. Just making sure. Awesome. So, living in Illinois, many of you might have encountered Blanding's turtles already, but I'll go through a little bit of background. So, Blanding's turtles are characterized by this bright yellow chin and this smiling face. They almost look like they have a permanent smile, and they're semi-aquatic, so they're slightly domed, a little bit more than a painted turtle, and are about medium size, being about a couple pounds at the largest for adult turtles. And they are endangered internationally and then state endangered in Illinois. And then throughout their range, which you can see here on the map in purple, they are a species of concern or something like that in all the other states. And they're up for federal listing, but as we know, that is kind of on pause right now, but hopefully they will be considered in the future. So these turtles rely on aquatic habitats, but they're semi-aquatic. So that means they're also using all of the uplands as well in the terrestrial habitats. So throughout their life, they have really large home ranges that encompass a lot of different habitat types. And ideally, they live in a place with mosaic-like patches of ephemeral wetlands, more permanent waterways, and uplands that can be used for hiding, traveling, as well as their nesting. And these turtles are very long-lived. Right now, I think the oldest reproducing Blanding's turtle that we know of she would turn 94 this year. So these turtles can continue to reproduce every single year until they die. But with this life history strategy, they have this delayed sexual maturity. So it takes for them to be at least 14 to 20 years old before they start reproducing. But then once they reach that reproductive age, they stop growing and start putting a lot of their resources into reproduction instead. And like I said, these turtles, then once they reach reproductive maturity, so around 15 years old, then they're going to keep reproducing every year until they die. So these adult turtles are incredibly valuable for population growth. And it's really important that these turtles continue to live and thrive and are able to make it to that ripe old age of 90 to continue that population growth and keeping this cycle, this self-sustaining cycle going. But because these turtles live long and they're pretty cryptic, they're hard to find just walking around in the field, studying them and doing conservation can be really tricky. It takes a long time and a lot of effort. And to address these gaps, there are a lot of different projects in the US and in Canada that are working to fill these gaps. And so one of these projects is at Viola's habitat in northern Illinois in Lake County. And starting in 2004, when a little bit after Blanding turtles became state endangered, at this site, they knew that they had a high quality wetland that was starting to decline, and there was history of a robust Blanding turtle population. So the Illinois Natural History Survey with the Lake County Forest Preserves began trapping and studying this population to see what is the status and what do we need to do to make sure this population is going to be there in the foreseeable future. So the sixth turtle captured as part of this study in 2004 was Viola. And at this point in time, Viola was already a large adult female. She's one of the largest adult females we have at our project. And she was at least 29 years old, but probably closer to 35 or 40 years old at this point of capture in 2004. So an old lady who's already been reproducing and laying eggs for a while, but still had a lot of time to continue to help her population. And after this initial survey period, which you'll notice is about 6 years long, which can often be longer than a lot of grants are right now. So it was a really great effort on the part of all of these partners to commit to this. They found that although there was a good population here, the turtle population was declining and the wetlands were actively becoming degraded, where it was very important to start intensive wetland restoration and more turtle specific conservation measures, things like turtle head starting, which I'll talk about in a little bit in more depth. So after doing conservation and implementing some of these management strategies, 5 years later in 2015, I joined this project and met Viola for the first time. And as this seasonal turtle technician, I quickly became enamored with Viola because she was this really large turtle, but also one of the more shy turtles. So she was a very interesting turtle that we were following along with a radio transmitter to monitor what she was doing. And she really helped inspire me to continue this work and dedicate the rest of my life to saving these turtles and their habitats. And ever since, I've been working with this project and other projects to figure out kind of these basic life history traits of Blanding's turtles and evaluating some of these conservation strategies that started in the early 2000s to figure out what are we doing right, what are we doing wrong, and how can we adjust it. So that adaptive management piece of conservation biology that is extremely important. So in Illinois, I'm sure everyone has seen this particular figure before. Right now, over 90% of the wetland habitats have been lost to agriculture and development. So the existing habitats that we have left are becoming degraded, and they're in these small patches that can be fragmented from others. So just off the bat, we have a lot less wetlands than we need for these turtles, and without active management, these wetlands are going to disappear even faster. And wetlands are super important. They have really unique abiotic conditions and complex structures, and also a seasonal structure where they vary throughout the year. And this allows the creation of complex food webs with a bunch of different niches that is going to support an incredibly high amount of biodiversity. So thinking more traditionally, we think of the rainforest as having all of these different niches that animals can fulfill or fill, but wetlands are almost as biodiverse because of that same complexity. And for us, wetlands also provide ecosystem services. And I know you were talking a little bit about that as I logged on this morning. So these wetlands are incredibly important for flood control, for maintaining water when there is a drought. They also can filter out pollutants and sediments and recharge groundwater. So these are not only important for all of the animals that live there, but their wetlands are really important for us as well. And some of these wetland dependent species that I will talk about today, you can see in the pictures here. So some of these species are able to live in wetlands because of those unique abiotic conditions. So kind of some of this acidity, the hydrology, low oxygen soils. So different from a large pond or a large lake where there's not as much complexity, and larger predators like big fish are able to quickly eat anything tiny. Wetlands kind of provide this spot for smaller species and a lot of different species to coexist and survive. And this creates this really complex food web. So we're seeing really neat species out in the wetlands, things like odonates, like amphibians, fishes, crayfishes, and other invertebrates. And they only can really survive in these wetlands. And then a subset of these wetland dependent species, we also consider an indicator species. So these species are your canary in the coal mine. If we see these populations dying off or disappearing, that means that the habitat quality is deteriorating. So these species are very sensitive to habitat changes and degradation. So studying them and knowing if they're there or not can tell us a lot about what's going on with that habitat quality. And some of these species are short-lived, so a generation time of a frog is only a couple years. So we can get kind of fast answers. We can see them disappearing in real time. Then on the other end of the spectrum, longer-lived species, things like Blanding's turtles, it takes a long time for them to disappear from a landscape, even as it's actively degrading, because they can live for so long. But we can also consider them umbrella species. So I mentioned that word earlier, and this is almost a type of indicator species where they depend on the wetlands and are definitely vulnerable to changes in degradation in habitat. But the very interesting thing about Blanding's turtles, like I mentioned before, since they're semi-aquatic, they don't only rely on that wetland, they're also relying on all of the entire landscape. So the uplands, the connectivity to other wetlands, and just the entire functioning connectivity of a landscape, many of those that we have here in the Midwest. So because of this, because they're using so much space and many different habitat types, if we aim conservation for towards Blanding's turtles, we can also conserve many of these other species, like these wetland dependent species, at the same time. So focusing on Blanding's turtles can help not just their population, but many other species as well. But to learn about Blanding's turtles, it's not quite as quick as seeing a frog species disappear. It requires decades of individual-based data on a lot of different factors. So next, I'm going to get into some of my questions and the methodology we use to sample these populations. So my main research questions I wanted to get into today was if we can detect those differences in habitat restoration, so anthropogenic changes to the landscape, whether that's us doing something positive like habitat restoration or things like human disturbance around wetlands. And if we see that in the presence or absence of some of these wetland indicator species, but then even further looking at Blanding's turtle population structure. So are we seeing only adults? Are we seeing reproduction in some young individuals? And then these really important adult females, are we seeing any of these changes to the habitat reflected in their health or reproductive ecology? And all of this information can help us make some management recommendations for these sites, just knowing how sensitive some of these species are to restoration or active degradation. So I started the story today by talking about this Viola's wetland, that high quality wetland. But today we'll look at two other wetlands as well that give us this gradation of human disturbance. So all of these wetlands are in Lake County in Illinois, but they vary and they're all very large wetlands, have a very large core wetland, are protected, and have a history of a Blanding's turtle population. So we have our suburban site, and just a disclaimer. So since Blanding's turtles are state endangered and poaching is one of the threats they face, we do not give out the specific locations of the sites where these turtles exist. So this picture here is not of this actual site. It is just a representation of what this site would look like, where there is a core wetland, but completely surrounded by development. So our suburban site is a protected forest preserve within the middle of a lot of development. So there's some suburban areas and also some commercial areas around there. And in This site has not had any restoration in the past 10 years, just due to, again, that limited resources, limited funding in conservation biology. And then we have our high quality wetland, and that's Viola's wetland, where there's a moderate amount of human disturbance. So there are roads on a couple sides, on two sides, but that core wetland has received a lot of habitat management, but the buffers and the uplands have not had as much restoration. And this is the site where there's also that turtle head starting. And then the last site we'll look at today is our adjacent site. So it's right next to that high quality wetland, and there is a lot lower human disturbance around this area, even though it's right next door. And here, there's no turtle management until I started working there, but their habitat restoration, instead of being focused on just that wetland, is more a landscape approach. So trying to conserve the wetlands as well as all the uplands. So how do we learn about these wetland species? What we do is we use baited hoop net traps and minnow traps to trap these species in their wetlands. So you can see some of these pictures here. This is a hoop net where we put usually sardines inside, and turtles and other animals can climb in the funnel of the hoop and kind of fall down where then they're not able to climb back out. And we always leave a little bit of air on the top to make sure that turtles and other animals are not being drowned. And we check these every 24 hours to take data and then safely release all of the animals that we have. And once we capture individuals, we'll record the species and how many of them there are, maybe some other demographics. And then with turtles, we collect even more information and then again, release those animals. So for these indicator species, like I said, we're going to record which species we find and how many there are. And this can give us a measure of presence and absence of certain species between all of these different sites. Then with our umbrella species, our Blanding's turtles, all of these turtles are part of a long-term capture, mark, recapture program. So that means that when we capture a turtle, each one gets an individual ID, and we take a lot of information about their demographics, so age, sex, reproductive status, other reproductive information, as well as taking health measures. So that's presence of or absence of different diseases, but also we do take blood to figure out things like white blood cell counts and stress levels and other things like that that you can find from that individualistic health measure. So this allows us to build these turtle life histories one at a time. So it's letting us follow these individuals over their lifetime and tracking things like growth, survival, reproduction, and everything like that. And this more in-depth information gives us that presence absence as well. Is the turtle at the site or not? But it also can give us this population level trends of demography, ecology, and health, which can give us a better insight of how these turtles are surviving at the site. And this is really hard work to be out there and collecting this data. We're out in the field every day, besides weekends, from May to September, doing this in rain or shine, catching turtles, catching other things, and documenting it. So this kind of comes back to that human aspect of things. How do we get people to come back and do this work every single summer over and over and over again so we can really understand what's these long-term trends? So one of the ways we addressed this human factor was creating a competition called the Blandings Bowl, which is this bio blitz basically where we get as many people as possible to come out and trap for 1 week to get a really high amount of captures and learn a lot more than what we can do with our typical crew, which is only a couple of us. And this is really proven to build community and momentum. And each year we get more and more people out doing this work and contributing to our data set. But our main character of the talk today, Viola, is featured, unfortunately, in one of the Blandings Bulls. So 2015, my first year being a turtle tech, oh no, my second year being a turtle tech, Viola went missing. Her radio transmitter had fallen off, and we feared the worst. We thought that she might have died and gone missing. So what we decided to do is make another rule in our Blandings Bowl, and anyone who captured Viola would get an extra 60 points. So she was our bonus turtle to try to motivate people to find her and figure out her fate. And fortunately, our fearless leader, this is Gary Glowacki. At the time, he was a wildlife biologist. Now he is the manager of conservation at the Lake County Forest Preserves. So he made a heroic leap into the wetland after seeing a bright yellow chin and was able to recover Viola. And we found her and put on a new radio transmitter, and we were able to continue to collect that data from her. And just to kind of show you a little peek of what this might look like, each time we find this turtle, we can put a dot on the map to give us this bigger data set about where turtles are going, what habitat types they're using, and then how that correlates with things like survival, reproduction, and health. And each one of these encounters, we're also getting all of this information about her size and reproduction, so also contributing to that growth. So now that you know how we actually do this and collect the data, we're going to get into some of our results of those sites for those indicator species. So for sake of time, we're just going to look at the difference between our high quality wetland, so Viola's wetland, and that suburban site. And again, both of these are similar size preserves and have a similar size core wetland and have Blandings turtles populations. And here we're wanting to answer that question, can we detect the differences in restoration and human disturbance in the presence and absence of those indicator species? So at the suburban site, again, that's surrounded totally by human use areas, and there has been a lack of wetland restoration. And in our high quality wetland, there's 2 of the 4 sides of the preserves have high human use, but there's been a lot of active habitat restoration or wetland restoration there. So the first thing we're going to look at between those 2 different sites is the number of species of different taxa. So we have, for example, on the left here, we have turtles, and in the high quality wetland, which is blue, we have 3 turtle species. And in the suburban wetland, which is in gray, we have 3 turtle species. So I'll give you a minute to look at this. And if anyone wants to speak up and tell me what you notice about the difference in number of species. So species diversity.
Yeah, this is Scott. The one thing that jumps out at me is the number of fish species in the high quality wetland versus the suburban wetland. And I'm assuming that has a lot to do with water quality. I just spent a lot of time up in the Pure Marquette watershed up in Michigan, and those are all groundwater fed streams that support trout. As you increase the amount of surface water into these water bodies, the number of trout species drops rapidly. So am I on the right track there?
Oh, totally. You guys didn't know that I was going to make you do homework too. Yes, definitely. So just looking at species diversity. So that's just how many species we're seeing. At the high quality site, we're seeing 20 species versus the suburban site, we're seeing 10 species with the similar amount of effort. So that's a really, really big difference. There's almost double the amount of species at that high quality site, and especially fish. So if we look a little bit more closely about the species composition, so which species are we actually seeing, we can learn a little bit more about these differences between sites. So at both sites, the high quality wetland as well as our suburban wetland, we're seeing these generalists and resilient species. So this is a white river crayfish in the middle that is a fairly widespread and resilient species. We see bullfrogs and green frogs at both sites. We see green sunfish and bluegill and black bullheads at both sites. So animals that are able to withstand some level of degradation and can adjust if conditions are changed. So that's not necessarily unexpected. But then if we look at the species and we see there are some invasive species that are found only at our suburban site. So rusty crayfish and goldfish were found at that suburban site. So these species it's important that we know that they're there because they can cause negative impacts to the native species that are there and disrupt that really delicate food web that we have in our wetlands. So some of these species will outcompete native species. They also can change the water quality and change the amount of vegetation and where that vegetation is. So they can be cause really negative impacts on those populations. And we're only seeing that at the suburban site. And a lot of these species are moved from site to site from people. So this is not necessarily unexpected again, but a little disappointing and maybe pointing towards a management action that needs to be taken at this site in the future. But then if we look at those habitat specialists, those sensitive species, the canaries in the coal mines that we were talking about earlier, if we look at fish species, we're seeing three different of these really habitat specialists at our high quality sites. So we have grass pickerels, central mud minnows, and I forget what that guy is. The top minnow. So those are all species that require high quality wetlands, but we are still finding the central mud minnows at our suburban site. So telling us that all hope is not lost there yet. And then if we look at amphibians and these more habitat specialist crayfish species, we're only finding these at the high quality site. No habitat specialists, amphibians, or crayfish were found at our suburban site. So telling us that those have disappeared from our suburban site, but are still able to continue to hold on with what is going on at our high quality site, and our restoration is helpful. And a couple of these species that I wanted to point out was the Great Plains mudbug, as well as the leopard frog and tiger salamander. So these are habitat specialists for wetlands, but throughout their life cycle, they also require upland habitat that is high quality as well, or at least right around that wetland. So seeing that we have these species means that not only is our wetland in a good condition, the immediately surrounding area seems to be supporting these species that need a little bit more as well. And as you kind of absorb that, we'll talk a little bit more about how Blanding's turtles can kind of maybe tell us the same thing. And the other cool thing about the Great Plains mudbug, which I've been nerding out a lot about crayfish, especially this year, they are these primary burrowers. So they're ecosystem engineers, where these burrows are the required by the endangered Heinz emerald dragonfly for their survival to complete their life cycle. So having some of these species is also allowing additional species and more of that complexity that makes our wetlands support so much biodiversity. So it's great that we're seeing all these at our high quality site. So some conclusions that I've talked about a little bit for looking between that suburban site and our high quality site with all of the restoration for the wetlands, we're seeing a lot more, almost double the diversity at our high quality wetland site, which includes some of those indicator species that are especially sensitive to habitat degradation, which is awesome. But at our suburban site, we're still seeing a little bit of diversity, but most of those species are generalists and invasive species. And without any active restoration here and continued development, they continue to reduce the available habitat and the quality. So if we want to see more diversity here, doing wetland restoration is of the utmost importance. And if you might have noticed, we did not look at the difference between turtle species between the sites, but don't worry, we are going to look at the population dynamics of turtles next. So we'll get into the Blanding's turtles results and then wrap it up at the end. So what we were looking at just before this was how many of which different species were at the two different sites. And if we were to look at the number of turtle species, we find Blanding's turtles, painted turtles, and snapping turtles at all three sites. So comparing the sites by just using presence absence of turtles is not going to provide us with any additional information, like looking at those habitat specialists and invasive species and things like that. So to learn from turtles and figure out how habitat quality is affecting them, we need to look a little bit more in depth about their demography and their health. So as I pointed out a little bit before, these turtles are long-lived and have several different distinct life stages. So they have eggs, hatchlings, a little bit older, pre-reproductive juveniles, and then that adult stage that's reproductive until about 90 years old. And each one of these life stages face different threats and have different habitat requirements, where eggs and hatchling survival are really reliant on having high quality upland and the connectivity of that upland to the wetland, where the turtles are able to hatch out and not be eaten, but also have enough of a corridor with enough cover to safely make it back to their core wetland. So these younger turtles, they also require a little bit shallower wetlands, more ephemeral wetlands with a lot of structural diversity so they can hide. And these turtles eat just about everything. But they need a little bit of everything. So they require also this really robust food base that they can eat from. And then adults, those are going to travel a lot more, with adult females traveling up to 2 miles to find their ideal nest site. And then males also traveling to find females. So they require a little bit deeper water sometimes throughout the year, but also the connectivity between all of these different wetlands on an even larger scale as well to survive and thrive. But what we're seeing in a lot of Blanding's turtles and other freshwater turtle populations is that these turtles are being affected negatively from both ends, where we're having unsustainably high adult mortality. So too many adults are dying, a lot from roads, dying early from unknown causes that we'll talk about in a little bit, and just really not having that habitat. And then we're also on the other end having reduced juvenile recruitment. So eggs are being predated. There's not any turtles that are hatching out. If they do, they're not able to make it back to adulthood. So we're losing too many adults and not having enough young turtles be able to make it to adulthood to replace those lost adults, sending these populations into this extinction vortex. And this also makes recovery really difficult and slow. So one thing that we do is head starting. This is one management solution that's really turtle specific. And I'm sure many of you have heard of head starting before, but I'll quickly talk about the logistics and the goal. So the goal of this is to hit that reduced juvenile recruitment and help with that side of things. And what we do is we're trying to protect turtles during that really vulnerable life stage. So when they're tiny, their shells aren't as strong, they're a nice little raccoon snack. So boosting their growth in captivity and putting them back out where they're hopefully going to make it to adulthood and increase that juvenile recruitment to combat that unsustainable loss of adults. And how we do this is by collecting eggs from wild females, bringing them into captivity, and then incubating them. Once they hatch, we will keep them in captivity. They will not overwinter, and we will feed them pretty regularly to increase their growth. And we do this for 1 to 2 years. Then we release them back out into the wild. So they're bigger, stronger. We protected them this whole time from predation. And hopefully the goal is these turtles are more likely then to make it to adulthood and help then continue that cycle of reproduction and replacing themselves out in the wild. And we are starting to see reproductive head starts at some of our sites, and they're successfully reproducing. So we are starting to see some really positive evidence from this. But to know this for sure, we really need this long-term monitoring. So when we release the turtle at 2 years old, we still need to wait 10 years to know if what we've done has actually worked or not. So I wanted to ask, can we detect differences in habitat restoration and that human disturbance side in that surrounded uplands in this Blanding's turtle population structure? So can we see that lack of juvenile recruitment and increased adult mortality between this suburban site, which is again that unrestored wetland surrounded by a lot of houses, versus our really high quality wetland where they've really invested in wetland restoration. So if we look just at the suburban site, we can see this is showing here how many turtles we captured before 2016 and then up into the present. So kind of taking a snapshot of what was happening for a decade and now what are we seeing and is there any shift? So the purple line, mostly purple bar here is showing younger juveniles. And in the middle, there is no bar for medium age juveniles. So that's around about like 8 to 16-year-olds. And then the green bar is representing the adults in this population. So pre-2016, we had over 20 adults, which is pretty good for Blanding's turtles. And at that point, one of the larger Blanding's turtle populations in Illinois. But we're not seeing any younger juveniles, and any of the really young juveniles, most of those are head starts. So they did some experimental head starting at this site as well to see if that could help. But then if we look at the next decade, we're seeing that there is a huge decrease in number of adults. They almost have, and there's almost no natural juvenile recruitment. And some of those adults were supplemented by those original head starts. So head starting might be helping, but it was not enough. And these turtles are not able to reproduce successfully on their own. And this is likely because of that poor upland habitat quality where they would have to go to backyards and cross roads to lay any eggs. So that's going to expose a lot of our turtles to roads and road mortality and probably places where there's fertilizer on lawns, and that's really causing this increased adult mortality. So then the next thing I wanted to look at is if we could look at that population structure between our high quality wetland and that adjacent wetland. So we're now going to forget about the suburban wetland and move into Viola's wetland, that high quality wetland. So remember, they've really focused on restoration in the wetlands, and they've been doing a lot of that head starting here as well. And then that adjacent site, there's been no turtle management, and their habitat restoration strategy is a larger scale landscape restoration where they're not just primarily focusing on that wetland, but also all of the uplands as well. So I wanted to see, can we see a difference in turtle population structure between these two sites? So here we're looking at a similar bar graph with, on the left, the high quality site, and on the right, the adjacent site. And we're looking at number of turtles captured within 1 year and which age class they're in. So if we start with a high quality site, we can see that there was 35 young juveniles caught that year, about 45 of those larger juveniles, so the ones that are going to be reproductive soon, so kind of replacing any lost adults. And then we found 65 unique reproductive adults, so within that 1 year, which is incredible. That's a really good sustainable population. And this is just looking at numbers that we caught and not necessarily our population estimate. So this is a really good news. This high quality site looks like it's doing really well. And then if we look at the adjacent site, that's mostly the green bars, we're also seeing a fair amount of all of these age classes, which is really promising, especially since we haven't done any turtle specific management there. So this larger scale restoration seems to be really good. And if we look more closely at these bars, you'll notice that kind of purple blue color that represents head started turtles, whereas the green represents wild turtles, so turtles that were hatched out in the wild. And at our high quality site, our kind of gem that we've been bragging about as our best turtle conservation, the majority of that young juvenile recruitment is from our artificial incubation and this kind of band-aid strategy, that head starting strategy, where we are seeing a little bit of recruitment, natural recruitment, but this population is really relying on our really intense conservation interventions here. Whereas our adjacent site, where no one is focused on turtles, we're seeing a huge amount of natural reproduction. And presumably this is because there has not just been a wetland specific habitat restoration strategy. So this led me to my next question, which is, what is going on with those adult female turtles when they're nesting? Why aren't they able to do that as effectively at our high quality site than the adjacent site? So my next question is then looking at the differences between habitat restoration between the high quality site and the one next door, with lower disturbance and more broad ecosystem restoration. What's going on? What are these adult female turtles telling us? So we looked at these different measures of health between adult female Blanding's turtles to help us try to understand what was going on. And at our high quality site, we were seeing a lot more ectoparasites, so a lot more leeches on our turtles, which generally turtles evolved with leeches, and some parasitic load is fine and doesn't seem to affect them. But at the high quality site, some of these turtles were overburdened by leeches. Then at our high quality site, the blood work suggested that the adult females had higher levels of inflammation and dehydration than the adjacent site. And this was especially during the nesting period, which was opposite of what was happening with the general population. So during the nesting period, when the females are leaving the wetlands to go on their nest forays, to go lay eggs and find that perfect spot, they are becoming, at the high quality site, they're having all of these sicknesses. They're not as healthy and they're more dehydrated. So we're generally seeing this lower plane of health at our high quality site, telling us that we're not addressing part of this turtle's life cycle at this site that we're really, really trying to support. So one possible explanation might be, is there a difference between that behavior and nesting habitat quality during this time between those two sites? So the first thing I looked at was, what was the difference between movement? And at the high quality site, we were seeing that adult females during nesting periods were crossing roads twice as much than at that adjacent site. And even though at the adjacent site, they might have been traveling a little bit more every week, they were not having to cross roads and kind of disturbed areas. And then if we looked at the nest site availability, so where do these turtles nest? At our high quality site, most turtles were nesting along the railroad tracks. So imagine those big rocks that are on the hill of the railroad tracks, turtles trying to dig through those, and the wetland, the staging wetland right below that has all of the runoff from everything coming from the railroad tracks. And all these are really close together. So one smart raccoon could find a turtle nest and go straight down the line and decimate that entire population's year of reproduction. But then if we looked at the adjacent site, the nest locations were a lot more scattered. And if we look at pictures, these are pictures of nesting turtles between these two different sites. At our high quality wetland site, these turtles are nesting in these huge rocks along the railroad tracks. That just does not seem like an ideal spot. Whereas the nesting habitat at the adjacent site are these beautiful, iconic areas that have nice sand that's going to be easier to dig in and can be separated from others. So if one turtle nest gets eaten, the raccoons or other predators are less likely to be able to go and find multiple at a time. It's going to be a lot more difficult than just going down the railroad tracks. So we found these differences, and that's interesting for science, but I think this is where I'm going to come back to that emotional piece. So during Blanding's Bowl last year in 2025, one of these adult females, Viola, we found her and she was not healthy. She was not feeling good after trying to lay eggs. And we brought her back to try to help her get more healthy. And she unfortunately passed away in our care. And this kind of made everything from that we were talking about the differences between these two populations and what we've provided them for their life history. It makes it really, really apparent and kind of makes it more important that it was this individual turtle that we had all grown to love was directly impacted by this negative, this poor habitat quality for nesting. And throughout Viola's life, she was our largest adult female in this entire population. And throughout studying her for about 2 decades, there was over 500 locations collected. So giving us a lot of information about habitat use of adult females. She also had the largest clutch size that we recorded, so 24 eggs in one clutch size. And she contributed 129 head-started offspring to that program that were then released back out into her population. And data that was collected on her was used in over 17, it keeps growing, scientific publications. So publications that have contributed to our understanding of Blanding's turtle survival, growth, reproduction, movement, habitat use, and health. So collecting this data on this one turtle has really helped us understand Blanding's turtles more generally and help conserve her population even better. And I also sat down to try to count how many individual people tracked her and fell in love with her. And I got to 70 and I stopped counting because there have been so many wildlife biologists, USDA biologists, students, technicians, and just many people who come out and met this turtle and fell in love with her. And when I shared of her passing, I had so many people coming back and telling me how important this turtle was to them and helped inspire them to continue their careers in wildlife biology. And you might notice that this turtle Viola was likely only 50 years old when she passed, which is earlier than she should have passed, meaning that we've lost decades of reproductive potential from Viola to this population. And much of this is likely due to that low quality habitat when she went to try to nest. So before I'll go back to a little bit of our conclusions and hopefully give some positive messages. But overall, from studying wetlands, we can learn a lot about, or the animals in the wetlands, we can learn about a lot about what the habitat quality is and help us tailor our restoration strategies to help all of these animals. And so just finding the presence absence of wetland species, especially these indicator species, we can get general insights into the wetland health. So like that suburban site, if we're just seeing generalist species and invasive species, that's likely a lower quality wetland. And then if we're seeing species with low dispersal capabilities and more sensitive species, then that wetland's probably higher quality. And when we look even more closely, so not just presence and absence, if we can look more closely at turtles, so their demography, that age structure, and their health, we can get a bigger picture of not just that wetland health, but the bigger ecosystem, the bigger landscape connectivity and health. So at that suburban site, when we saw that loss of upland habitat, we were seeing less juvenile recruitment and that really rapidly decreasing adult population. But we're at the high quality site, we see strong wetlands, which means we have juveniles surviving really well, but those degraded uplands might have been contributing to the rapid decline of some of the adult females, which was not as rapid as at the suburban site where turtles were directly being hit by cars, but we are seeing it in examples like Viola, where she's dying earlier than she should have because she's exposed to these types of lower quality upland nesting areas. So my kind of take home message is that because these turtles are are reflecting the larger ecosystem health, if we are continue to aim our restoration at Blanding's turtles, but all of their life history, we're going to be able to benefit a lot of these other species as well. And doing the wetland restoration and connectivity with uplands, and those upland restoration is going to improve habitats for turtles specifically, but a lot of these wetland species we talked about and all of the upland species that we haven't even talked about today. So just to kind of repeat my big point here about our turtles, especially Blanding's turtles, being this umbrella species. Protecting Blanding's turtles means protecting the wetlands and these uplands that sustain countless other important species. So these turtles connect wetlands, uplands, and because they live for decades on the landscape, they see ecosystem changes, and studying their populations can really help us learn about what the changes from the past are doing and affecting the populations now, and how we need to move forward to help save not only the turtles, but everything else that's wonderful within these Midwestern habitats and ecosystems. And I think my other point outside of the science is that even though I learned in my traditional training that I was supposed to be unbiased, I think that scientific rigor is important, but this empathy and being able to connect with individual animals can really fuel long-term science and help people coming back and doing all of the hard work. And a lot of these long-term research on turtles is really revealing some of these hidden gaps in our restoration strategy and will be implemented in the future to make sure we're not just having our restoration be single species or single habitat focused, but addressing broader landscape scale restoration. And to not leave you on a negative note, 1 month after Viola had passed, we had trapped at a new spot in the wetland, and we had caught one of Viola's offspring, and her name was Sansa. She was a head start, and she had just reached reproductive maturity and will start reproducing likely this year. So Viola's legacy is still continuing, and her head starts are out there continuing to help this population sustain itself. And before I open it up for questions, I just wanted to thank all of the different people. I want to thank you all for having me come out and talk to you today, as well as all of the people that provided funding and allowed us to work on their sites. And I also wanted to emphasize none of this work was done just by me. There was so many dedicated technicians, veterinarians, biologists that have contributed time and hard work to make all of this data happen and make us be able to understand how to better conserve our natural landscapes. So with that, I will open it up if anybody has any questions.